What does it take to make workshops work? Many actually agree that one of the key skills of a facilitator is listening. And we hear buzzwords like active listening and deep listening. So I wanted to learn more about that. And I had a discussion with Oscar Trimboli, the deep listening expert, who joined me for this conversation from Australia. And since we could not stop talking, we recorded for over 90 minutes. So we decided to cut it in two. So welcome to the bonus episode of the Workshops Work podcast, a conversation with Oscar Trimboli about deep listening, the difference to active listening, and what it means for a facilitator or coach. So stay tuned. Hello, Oscar.
G'day, Miriam.
Welcome on board of the Workshops Work podcast.
I've been looking forward to listening to your questions all week.
And I'm looking forward to listen to your answers to your questions. You've been challenging me on social media already.
Well, I hope I'm challenging ideas and not you. I think it's an important distinction to think about. We hear a lot in workshops about, challenge these people. And what I always say is there's a big linguistic distinction between challenging the idea and challenging the person. So hopefully I've been challenging the thoughts you've been putting out on social media rather than just you.
Totally. And thank you for pointing this out. It's indeed an important difference. Yeah. And I never felt to be challenged as a person. I did like the food for thought. So please keep on doing that.
Excellent.
And today we're going to talk about the obvious, about deep listening and the relevance of listening in workshops as a facilitator, but also as a participant. And before we dive into that, I would be curious to know your story. How did you get from IT, I guess, into coaching, into listening?
I'll tell you 3 stories that kind of bring it all together. I grew up very close to a migrant centre where if you arrived in Sydney for the first time, you'd arrive at the Villawood Migrant Centre. And the school I went to, we had 23 nationalities, which meant we had fantastic lunches to swap. No boring sandwiches, all kinds of nationalities. And when I was going to school, there were wars happening in Asia, there were wars happening in South America, and there was undeclared wars, I guess, in Eastern Europe. There were a lot of people from Poland, from Yugoslavia fleeing to Australia. There were a lot of people from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and a lot of people from Argentina, Uruguay, and from Chile coming to Australia as well. And one of the things we did was play card games, and the card games we typically played was an Italian card game. And most people wouldn't know this, but I have this thing called dyscalculus, which means I can't count cards. I have a very poor relationship with numbers altogether. But what I was really good at doing was reading body language. So no matter what language the other team were playing in, their body language was giving away what was on their cards. And I can only speak one language, which is English. And I didn't really understand why everybody wanted me on their team, no matter what nationality they came from, because I could read the body language that people were giving away in their card games. It didn't take long for people to figure out what I was up to, and I was banned from playing cards, not because I counted the cards, but because I was listening to body language. Wind the clock forward to where you picked up the story about IT. I was challenged consistently by a lot of the leaders I worked with. Oscar, if you could code how you listen, you could change the world. And when you work at Microsoft, when somebody says to you, code that, and I remember Tracy saying this to me after a very tense negotiation between our global, regional and local officers around a budget negotiation. She asked me to stay back after the meeting. There were 11 people in our room from Microsoft on our side on this video conference. And when your vice president says, please stay behind after the meeting, you kind of think, how far ahead is my pay? Have I got 3 months, 6 months? How long could I last without a job? What's going to happen to my career? And Tracy sat me down and said, at the 22-minute mark, you realize you changed the complete perspective of the room, not just here, but in Seattle and Singapore. If you could code that, you could change the world. And I said to Tracy, do you mean code or code? And by code, I mean put it into software. And by code, it just means define it as a pattern or a method. And if anybody's had exposure to the technology industry, maybe they'll understand that. But I was challenged because I'd never really understood that my listening was a superpower. And in that moment, and honestly, Miriam, it was 30 seconds. I went, and then I forgot about it until 2 weeks later, where the chief financial officer, who was also the chief operating officer, we had the opposite conversation with our organisation in Australia. We had to take the budgets we were given and cascade those down to all the geographies around Australia. And again, I made a not too dissimilar observation in the first third of the meeting. And the observation I made was, because the meetings get really tense, particularly when you're trying to help people understand a new construct. And I simply said, what assumptions are we holding on to that might be false as it relates to this budget negotiation? And the kind of tension went out of the room. And Brian said to me after the meeting, the chief financial officer, he said, I need you to teach me how to do that. And I said, Brian, I have no idea what you're talking about. That thing you did again, you did it in the Redmond meeting. Now, how do I learn how to do that? And in that 3 weeks, I kind of went, oh, I don't know how to do that, and completely forgot about it again. And then somebody said to me, which was Brian's PA, hey, it's time for you and Brian to get together for your monthly one-on-one, but he wants you to teach him that listening thing so he can figure out what that meant. So it's not a lightning bolt moment, Miriam, where somebody kind of pointed it out or I noticed it. It's just been a peeling of an onion over decades to come down to this call, because I think what Tracy said and what Brian said and what others say to me is I listen to who people mean to be and what they're trying to say, not what they actually say, and it's my ability to listen beyond the words. So it was a mentor who challenged me, though, not too far back in the past, about 4 years ago, and said, what's your goal? How many listeners can you transform before you leave this planet? And I said to Matt, well, a million. And he goes, what, 1 million? And I said, yeah, that's a lot of people. He said, come back next month and tell me how you make it 10 million. So I come back next month and I figured out how to make it 10 million. And then he says, add a zero. I said, Matt, are we going to play this game every month? And he said something really potent to me. I remember these words for the rest of my life. If your goal can be achieved in your lifetime, it's not ambitious enough.
Wow.
So 100 million deep listeners, I don't know if I'm ever going to achieve it. But in posing that question to me, Matt changed my perspective and the way I think about teaching 100 million people how to listen. And how I go about doing that is completely different now. In the early days, I thought, well, these people I have to do face-to-face, one-on-one or in group trainings. But now I'm thinking about listening apps on phones, and I'm thinking about how I can work with other leadership coaches, facilitators, and trainers around the world about how they can help people listen to themselves to make a difference beyond words. Because most of us listen in black and white, yet we have the capability to listen in a wide range of technicolors. And that's my hope for the world, that they can learn to listen in the same range that they learn to see.
And there are a few questions coming up for me now. And one thought. So one thought is, and then I can put this aside, that maybe it's just about starting early. So to start with children in kindergarten and primary school on how to listen and what listen actually means. But this would maybe deviate. And the questions are, one, what is the difference between active listening and deep listening? And related to that, how many senses do we actually need to deeply listen?
I'm curious about the concept you dismissed about kindergarten.
We can come back to that.
Okay. For those of you who weren't watching, Miriam kind of turned her head to one side when she kind of put the kindergarten children to one side in the conversation. And if you're on a mobile device, it's very difficult to listen to somebody if you're not paying attention to what's going on their face. So the first question, what's the difference between active listening and deep listening? The active listening movement, really important, started in the 70s and the 80s, and its primary orientation is focus on the speaker and understand what the speaker means from a listener's perspective. So that makes a number of assumptions. The active listening movement talks about paraphrasing, for example, or non-verbal affirmations such as mm-hmm. And these are all very important things. I think active listening is foundational to deep listening. But active listening is focused on two levels of listening: listening for the content and listening for the context. Deep listening, we explore 5 levels of listening, and the starting point is not the speaker. Deep listening starts with listening to you. You can't listen to somebody else if you're having a conversation in your own head. If you have a dialogue going on right now about where you should be this evening, where you should be tomorrow morning, where you should be on the weekend, what's on your shopping list, what's on your travel schedule, you're in this dialogue. In fact, for a lot of you, it's happening right now. You're not even paying attention to what I'm saying. You're just in a dialogue with yourself. You see, Miriam, 86% of people struggle with listening because of themselves, their internal distractions and their external distractions. So to access the other levels of listening, listening for the unsaid and listening for meaning, you can't access those unless you have the foundation in place to be present in the conversation. It's very difficult to listen for what's unsaid when you're listening to the radio station playing in your own head that's tuned into a frequency about you. And that takes work, that takes effort. The active listening movement is important, it's foundational, but with deep listening, we want to move the orientation away from the listener making sense of what the speaker's saying. And the big distinction between active listening and deep listening helps the speaker make sense of what they're saying rather than the listener making sense of what the speaker's saying. That makes listening light, that makes listening easy, that makes listening potent, powerful, and creates an impact beyond words.
Very interesting. And this brings me back to the children, actually. Because while you were speaking, I was thinking it makes total sense with everything that we have in our mind, and especially now in our conversation. Me, of course, having in mind, okay, what could be a next question to ask, or what am I thinking while you're speaking? How can I connect? And to what extent will it be important or interesting to the audience? Because it's not only a conversation between you and me, but there's so many other people that I don't see who are listening. So it's, on the one hand, I thought that it takes a lot of self-confidence to deeply listen, because this means that I need to trust that I will come up with something to connect to what you just said without making a plan beforehand. And on the other hand, I thought maybe it's not self-confidence or maturity, maybe it's just presence, and then it would be a skill that's actually, I think, that children have instinctively and that we unlearn with age. So it would actually make sense to learn deep listening or to become aware of deep listening very early in age so that we don't unlearn it over time. Does it make sense?
Yes, I'm just reflecting on what you say. It goes back even further, Miriam. at 20 weeks inside your mother's womb, you can already distinguish the sound of your mother's voice from any other sound. And you're listening for your mother's voice. It's genetically coded in us. It's a survival instinct to ensure that we can survive once we're born. Yet at 32 weeks, we can distinguish Beethoven from Bon Jovi from Beaver. At 32 weeks, we already have the skill to listen and distinguish. So it's not about hearing, it's about the ability to distinguish, because a child in the womb will react differently to classical music from rock music, for example. So it's not that they're just hearing, they're actually making meaning of what that music is. Yet the very act of birth, and you talk about this unlearning, the very act of birth, the moment you are put down on a birth certificate as the day and time you were born, was the moment you screamed in the world. And we spend the rest of our life trying to be noticed by speaking. And we've all been trained in how to speak. Yet none of us have been trained in how to listen. In fact, the statistics are really simple. 2% of us as adults are trained in how to listen. Yet 47% of us are trained in how to listen. That makes sense to some degree, but if communication is speaking, 50%, and listening, 50%, you would hope that more of us would understand the syntax of listening, the palette of listening, the operators of listening, plus, minus, divide, subtract. We know that about maths, but what is that for listening? Because we don't have this construct. And that makes listening hard. It makes it easy for us to get distracted. And you're absolutely right. If we have the energy of natural naivety and curiosity, that's why deep listening is a very restful state. You don't have to anticipate the next question. You don't have to create pace and tempo in the dialogue. One of the things you can create is space through silence, for example. And a lot of workshop facilitators, for example, probably don't use that kind of space enough. And how much can silence do things for us? As David Rock would say, how do we let silence do the heavy lifting? So I think your proposition, your hypothesis around what can children teach us about listening is quite powerful. And yet at the end of our life, if we're relatively healthy, the last sense we lose is the sense of hearing. That's the last thing we do when we leave the planet. So hearing and listening is there before we're born, and it's there when we leave our consciousness and leave our bodies, whatever your spiritual or religious belief might be about that change of state in that moment. Because I've interviewed a number of doctors and palliative care nurses, and one of the things they say consistently is, despite the fact a parent or a grandparent or an auntie or an uncle may lose the capacity to speak, hearing is the last thing they do. And if you look at their eyes, they'll tell you very quickly. If you're arguing over the bed at the hospital about where they're at or what kind of treatment they should have, you need to ask the patient. And that becomes kind of full circle on your question. You need to use all your senses when it comes to listening. And when I say all your senses, that includes your gut feel and using all your sensing capability as a human, not just our ears, our eyes. You can feel, you can sense, and that will make a very big difference in the way you listen. But if you're bowing down and your head is focused on a mobile phone, it's impossible to use all those senses, because the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's most used for listening, is engaged when you're on the phone. So although you're hearing, you're not actually listening.
I'm Rain. I'm from Experiential Learning. We facilitate programs for executives, and we use Session Lab because it's a very easy tool to design a meeting, easy to share with your colleagues, and get a script for the meeting in no time without too much hassle.
So visit sessionlab.com and find out more yourself. And you referred to body language before. So deep listening also means making sense of body language, of mimic, of visual clues.
Equally, state change, the energy a person displays in a moment. So it's not just what they show you with their smile or the wrinkle that might come to their cheek or their eyebrow going up or even their body position, whether their arms are folded or not. A human in tune with another human will notice their energetic state. And for a lot of us, again, we're not paying attention to that. At the moment, the state I'm observing from Miriam while I'm having this conversation is a state of curiosity. And the minute I mentioned state, she leant forward, her shoulders moved back, and she leaned in closer to the camera. So before that, she was leaning back a bit. She was much more relaxed. So the state change is what I noticed in that moment. But again, if your head's buried in a mobile phone, you're not going to notice that state of change. I'll use a practical story, though. I was working with a leader. This would be 2017, and they were dealing with a very complex organizational merger where they were merging with another organization. They were the acquiring entity, and they were trying to figure out a whole bunch of things. This was one-on-one. We're going to spend some of the time together today to talk about this in a group context as well. And he was in a dialogue with himself. Darren was telling me all the things that were going wrong with this merger. And I said, tell me more. What else? And just let him get as much out of his head as possible. And I simply asked him, what's it like for the people who have been acquired? Now, he's quite animated up until that point, but in that moment, he leant back, his eyes almost rolled back as he looked at the ceiling, and it only happened for about, at most, 2 seconds. And he started in dialogue again and got very animated. But that state change in that 2 seconds is something I came back when he'd finished. And I said, Darren, a few minutes ago when I posed that question, I noticed your head went back. I noticed your eyes went up. And I noticed your physical state change. Tell me more about that. And he moved out of a very rational description at that point and moved into a description about how they felt rather than the feeling of all this story and language about a corporate that he was feeling in that moment. So all the conversation up until that time had been really, really rational. It was really dissecting, sequential, logical. And in that moment, where he had to connect with how it felt to be them, his energy changed. And I said, let's go and play with that if you're okay. And he simply made the reflection, I've never thought what it's like to feel at work.
Wow. That's big.
So you can imagine the conversation took a completely different direction from that point on. It's in noticing state change. So that's their actual presence. Sometimes it's accompanied by a big sigh. They'll breathe out and they'll exhale very heavily. Or the opposite, they'll inhale and hold that for a moment. But again, if you're not paying attention, if your focus isn't on them and helping them make sense of it, Miriam, these moments are completely lost. And that's the power, that's the impact beyond words that you want to pay attention to.
So do you think that you came closer to find the code?
I don't think I'll ever find the code. I think what I've discovered is every hypothesis I've submitted to myself and to others has continued to progress, but code implies some level of binary. And I think there are some elements that can be coded. And I think there are some elements that are pure human chemistry, as I just described then. that in that moment of noticing a human with a human, that's difficult to code unless you've got a video camera on that person in that moment. So I don't make an assumption that this is my idea. I know it's an idea that's just coming through me, and that this idea has been transmitted over lots of people and lots of lives. I'm just happen to be the one who's catching it at the moment. So I'm really open to the possibility I could be completely wrong.
And I was asking because on the one hand, what you describe, that you find clues by paying attention of changes in posture, changes in breathing and energy, and this can be coded or put into a structure that is repeatable and thereby teachable. Whereas other things are purely instinct, intuition, superpower. So I think we do have an instinct that if our mimic, for instance, is not aligned with the words that we are saying, that we get this gut feeling that something is not kosher here. Yeah. So it's difficult to explain why we don't believe a person, and still very often we are right. So I think this is also part of deep listening, which is maybe not codable.
And yet Susan Constantine, who I interviewed in North America, otherwise known as the human lie detector, has been working with a lot of jury selection activity where she's trying to teach judges how to notice people who are actually telling the truth, because judges are so coded into believing that everybody's actually lying to them.
Awesome.
So it's the inverse of teaching body language and structures and all of this. And by far the most coding of anybody done at this level in terms of body language is done by Susan Constantine, as she has been working with a number of machine learning software companies where she's licensed this to other organizations using video cameras as well as audio cues in this regard as well. But ironically, she's been brought on board by police forces and judiciary to help them understand that this is what the truth looks like, as opposed to assuming everybody's lying to them.
What would be the first thing that someone has to learn to become a deep listener?
The first thing is it starts with you. So as much fun and as distracting as it might be to focus on Miriam right now, I need to be making sure I'm not being distracted, making sure right now that my focus is on you, not me. Making sure that I have enough empty space in my head where that can land. And when I notice something coming in that's distracting me in the moment, I just simply tap on the table next to me, and that's a place I put that idea and come back to it later. To do that, 3 things to start with you. Number 1, external distraction. Remove the cell phone. If you can't remove the cell phone, switch the cell phone into flight mode. If you can't put it into flight mode, put it into silent mode. And if you can't put it into silent mode, switch all the notifications off on all the apps. And I think I've given you enough range that anybody could pick from that, depending on the level of addiction you have to your device at the moment. The second thing is that a hydrated brain is a listening brain. The brain is only 5% of our body's mass, yet it consumes 26% of the blood sugars in processing things. So the fastest way to get blood sugars to the brain is make sure we're not dehydrated. If you love coffee, that's great. Drink as much coffee as you like, but for every cup of coffee you drink, you need to drink a glass of water and 1 extra. Wow. And if you're in a conversation with somebody else, offer them a glass of water as well. A lot of people say when they start to think about listening, their head hurts. What that really means is they're dehydrated. So for most of us, we go throughout the day in a state of dehydration. And we should be drinking between 1.5 and 3 litres of water a day, depending on the kind of activity we're undertaking. Yet most of us think hydration is how many cups of coffee we've had during the day. And we need to be careful of that. So tip number 1, remove the external distractions. Tip number 2, help your brain remove some of the internal distractions by giving it the blood sugars it needs. Drink water, be hydrated. And tip number 3, the deeper you breathe, the deeper you listen. If you keep in mind the following, and this is a ritual that I do before every customer meeting I go to, I enter the lobby of the building, I stand there, I switch my phone off, I put it in my bag, I go to the lift, I practice 3 deep breaths, which are simply in through your nose, down your throat, all the way through to the bottom, right down to your diaphragm and then back up again. We're not doing yoga poses in a lift. We're just connecting with our breathing. And if we do that, that will last approximately 15 seconds and your brain will be in a completely different state. Now, whilst I'm doing that, I'm posing the question to myself in that moment, is my intention on those I'm about to meet or myself? By the time I'm finished breathing, my intention has moved out. And then when I arrive, I usually get offered a refreshment. I always ask for water. And depending on how many participants are at the meeting, I always ask for water for them also. That's how difficult it is to integrate it into your practice. And if you're facilitating groups, the question I would ask you is, although there are jugs of water that are probably well below the temperature they need to be, are you instructing the group to drink water during the day, particularly after lunch? You will create a different state in the room if that room is hydrated. The mints in a meeting room for these facilitations, what are you trying to create there? Is that a default because you're going to a hotel room, or are you designing that? So think very carefully about the physical state you create for participants as it relates to curating a listening environment. I'm very deliberate at lunch, for example, to work with a venue to have as many low-carb options as possible and give the room a verbal cue. Hey, as you're going out to lunch, some of you may struggle to process the after-lunch session. If you avoid breads and pastas and rice out there, you're likely to get more out of the afternoon. But that's completely up to you, and I just make an invitation for them. But that's how conscious I am about creating a listening environment for everybody, both physically and mentally as well. And Miriam, they sound like really basic things, and yet as the owner of the space, the authority in the room when you're facilitating, how conscious are you to play to those simple things? To just before an exercise, I will often say, hey, this exercise is going to stretch us also. Before we do, just grab a glass of water, and when you've got halfway through it, that means you're probably ready for this exercise.
Yeah.
So for those who aren't watching, Miriam's nodding, and I'm super curious what she's thinking right now.
I'm just processing what you're saying. And one is, it sounds simple, but most of the time it's the simplest things that we often forget because we take them for granted and then we don't write them down. We don't implement them into our routine. So it's even more important to make it part.
Yeah.
And then
it reminds me of a story of a Japanese company I was working with who'd read my book before I ran the workshop. And the Japanese country manager stood up to 80 people managers in the room and said, I've read Oscar's book. It's beautiful. I acknowledge that there is both Eastern wisdom and Western pragmatism in the book. I've read it for the last month every week. This book is simple, but its practice is difficult.
Yeah.
And like any practice, it's just the commitment to the ritual and the habits every day. And if you love a great book on habit formation, Atomic Habits by James Clear is a book I strongly recommend to everybody.
Yes.
It's all about micro change, really small micro change. It's not that you want to go to the gym. It says put your clothes and your shoes out before you go to bed. Get into that ritual first, and then you're more likely to go to the gym.
And make them so small, these habit changes, that you cannot not do it. And I can totally relate to that. I started once with daily exercise, and I started with 2 push-ups every day. Waking up, having a glass of water, 2 push-ups. And then over the course of 3 years, I ended up with 3 sets of 25. Wow. And that's just so deeply in my habits that I cannot not do it, because it's like leaving the house without brushing the teeth. So I'm a big fan of these small habits. Do you practice meditation or any form of mindfulness? Because
probably not the way you think I do.
So what is your assumption of what I think you do, and what is your practice?
I sense most people think meditation is something you need to have a place and a space to do it in, and a time. And for me, I'm a crazy kind of guy. I learned to swim as an adult, and I learned to swim in the ocean as an adult. So, especially in Australia, where there's no shortage of things that are going to eat you in the ocean. It was 2011 where somebody suggested I should learn how to meditate. And I went, yeah, okay, fine, no problem. What's this whole meditation about? And I went, okay, well, I'll learn the silent meditation, and I'll do the 10-day silent meditation. I'd never done anything in my life in meditation, yoga, any of that. And so I decided to check myself in to a 10-day silent retreat. And all I managed to do was really strain my hip muscles. And I always remember what the instructor said at the end: as you go out into the world, only a monk like me can meditate the way we have every single day. And for some of you, you will begin a practice where you will be able to meditate for an hour before you rise in the morning and start your routine. But for the rest of you, I give you permission to meditate at any moment during the day, whether that's eating breakfast, drinking a glass of water, eating lunch, eating dinner, walking in the park. You should integrate meditation into everything you do rather than meditation being something that you do. So for me, my meditation is noticing and being grateful for my toast in the morning. My meditation is I'm grateful that I can walk from meeting to meeting in a city that I'm in. So I'm not the kind of person that would sit still before I went to bed or when I woke up in the morning and take time aside to empty my head. That's my assumption, what you meant by meditation. What about you?
I do these 10 days meditation retreats. I just came back from my 3rd Vipassana. So I do sit in silence. And I also believe that it's not only about that. So the benefit of meditation is not being able to sit in silence and to sit in discomfort, which is even more important than the silence. But it's to practice this muscle in order to be able to do what you just described.
Yeah.
So for me, doing the sitting is like going to the gym. So I'm training a muscle to, first of all, be able to sit in discomfort without reacting, to notice, oh, this feels uncomfortable and I don't need to react right now because it will pass. And the other is to clear the mind and to notice when being present or to be present with someone. So to be in this meditative state when the both of us are having this conversation. Thank you for staying tuned and listening to the show. I appreciate your attention as I know how busy you are. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and engage by sharing your comments and thoughts, and visit workshops.work to download the one-page summary. I'm looking forward to seeing you back at the next episode, and I wish you a fruitful day.